Fantastic. So welcome to everybody to today's session. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to be joined today by Steve Couch and also by Dr. Susan Rose, and I will let them do a little bit more of an introduction, but all three of us have things in common. So all three of us have been in leadership positions. Steve was a partner at PwC for many years. Susan has been in a leadership role at Henley Business School. And the other thing that joins us all together is coaching. So all three of us are coaches. And we're also all researchers. So I was just talking to Steve. Steve's recently, well, I say recently, it's probably about a year ago now, done some research into cultural expectations around team coaching. Some of you online will know that I've recently published a report into what was the class of 2002, so my intake that I joined Herbert Smith Freehills with, looking into diversity across the legal profession. And Susan has recently published research into self-confidence and the impact that that has on women in leadership. So really delighted that the two of us can join today. The format is going to be very similar to other events that I've run for those that have been to some of my events. I will do an introduction and then I will open the floor to Steve and to Susan to speak a bit about the topic today. And then we will bring everyone in, because we all know that sitting and listening to us for an hour, 3 hours, an hour is a lot. So we want to hear your voices too. The chat is there, so do feel free to use it. And if a question pops into your head as we're going through, do please use the chat function. Now, the heading that I've put on this slide is Leadership Time for a Change. And I keep changing the title of this session. So I started off by calling it Women in Leadership, and it is something we are going to talk about today. But I wanted to attract more men to the event, so that Steve wasn't the only one on the call. I think looking at the list, Steve, you are the only man on the call today. At the very least, you're in the minority, so that's a shame. But one of the things that I then changed it to try and attract more of a balance was transformational leaders, because we're going to be talking about that too. And I've put time for a change because that's something we're going to be talking about. So welcome. As I've said, we're going to think about leadership styles today, and we're going to think about them in different ways, and we're going to think about in the context of the makeup of our leaders and how we can get more diverse leaders representing us all. We started by thinking about what objectives we've got for today and what we would like you to take away from the session. And there are two things really. One is an understanding of the difference between transactional and transformational leadership, and Susan's going to tell us a little bit about that in a moment. And we also, because I've done lots of talks now on this topic, as I'm sure both Steve and Susan have, and being coaches, we all strive for change. And so what we want is for you to all go away with something positive, to be able to go away and make a positive change in your workplace. So that's what we're going to hopefully give you today. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to just start with why we're talking about this. And I'm going to start with, for some, what might be a recap, for others it might be an introduction into some of the findings that I found, and clearly not practicing these slides today, but I want to let you into something that I found when I was doing my research. And one of the things that I found as a reason why women from my intake did not succeed, and I say succeed, but didn't make it to partner or GC, was very much tied into the culture in law. and I looked into the 24/7 culture. That's not something we're going to talk about today. But something that I also looked into was this idea of culture being not only how we do things around here, which is a definition that we often use when we talk about culture in organizations, but who does things around here. And that's because in law firms, as in other professional services firms, there are a number of leaders, a number of partners, and that often sets the tone for the culture in the firm. So one of the things that I asked the people that I surveyed was, what are the traits that you identify in partners? And partners and non-partners answered in a very similar way. And men and women answered in a very similar way. In the middle of those traits that everyone kind of identified as being the top traits for partners, so you can read the words there, and the difference was that the women identified as partners as being strong, and the men identified partners as being collaborative. Now, the reason why this was interesting, and we're going to dig down a bit deeper on the call today, is that these were traits that by and large people didn't necessarily identify in themselves as being, you know, traits that they would say that were the top traits that they identified with. And it's also interesting because there's a lot of overlap here with the concept of the ideal worker, which is something that is found in gendered organizations. So this idea of the worker that has nothing else other than work, that turns up and is something that can stand in the way of women making it to the top.
Looking forward to us going away next weekend.
Oh, so someone's not on mute there, so I don't know who that is, but if you can just check you are on mute. Fantastic. So I've discussed this with Susan, I've discussed this with Steve, I discussed this with lots of other people. So what I want to do, just to sort of start to get us thinking, is I want to share a slide on, and this is something that Deloitte did, and you can type into Google the 6 traits of inclusive leadership and you will see the report that Deloitte published. But they came up with six traits of inclusive leaders, and commitment here is in the context of leaders treating diversity as a business priority and taking personal responsibility for outcomes, and that's something I speak a lot about. Courage to challenge the status quo, that's something we're going to talk about later. Cognizance of bias, so being mindful of both personal but also organizational blind spots. Being actively curious. Cultural intelligence, I've mentioned this is something that Steve will, I'm sure, have something to talk about later on. And also collaboration. And what's interesting around collaboration, you know, men identified partners as being collaborative, but in this context, it's about underlining the importance of group intelligence rather than individual intelligence. The next slide I want to share is the traits that O-shaped lawyers want to see in lawyers. So it's what clients would like lawyers to be. And again, you can have a read of those. But what's interesting for me here is that whilst relationship building came out in those top traits, other things that we can see here, empathy notably, didn't come out, yet that was something that the women identified strongly with. So where I want to start, and the reflection that I have, is why is there such a consensus about the traits that we see in partners and how they lead? What does that mean for diverse leadership, diverse teams, and, you know, not just thinking about gender here? And what can we do about it all? So that's enough from me. Hopefully the slides have given you some food for thought. But what I want to do now is I want to bring in Susan, first of all, and just remind everyone, if you do have questions, I know some people have just joined us, do feel free to put those in the chat, and we will pick them up as we go along. We will also have some breaks so that you can join and participate in the conversation. But first of all, I want to pass over to Susan, and I just want to start with a really broad question and just find out whether what I have discussed has fitted in with your your experience of leadership.
Yes, thanks, Claire. Clearly, what you've been talking about there is very specific to professional services and particularly the legal industries. A lot of the work that I have done is kind of look more broadly, and a lot of the literature and the research that I draw on. So it was interesting that you talked there about styles, and there are many, many different models or frameworks that try to, as it were, create the ideal. And I guess that's one of the things we're always striving for. And I'm kind of not really looking for an ideal. I don't think that's very helpful. But what is helpful is to understand that different styles of behavior are more or less effective in different circumstances. And so one of the ways in which leadership has been looked at is in terms of two styles known as transactional and transformational, which is partly what you've been alluding to. So just to sort of say what that is about is that in a transactional way of leading, such leaders are seeking to get the job done. It's very task focused. Quite often it's about process and control of either structures or systems in the organization. So transactional leaders are very good at maybe the shorter term. So this quarter's figures, do we meet them? Do we reach them? About providing resources and making sure that the people that they lead have the right resources, the right capabilities, know what their targets are, know what their goals are. And we're all kind of like rowing in the same boat in the same direction is one way of looking at it. It's very much sort of ends driven in terms of achievements. Transformational leadership is what we see happening in particular when we're looking at change going on in organizations. So transformational leadership is much more around leaders who are good at supporting individuals in their team to achieve. And by achieving, therefore, we collectively move forward in terms of change. So transformational leadership is very people first. As you'd already mentioned, the words collaboration, kind of collective support and so on. Transformational leaders are very good at people focus, and they are very good at encouraging others to achieve. So they allow autonomy in their teams. They're happy for people to take authority to make decisions, and they look at the longer vision of where we're going. As a consequence of some of that, those two kind of styles, you can say, okay, so what kind of leaders, what kind of characteristics do leaders have? And it has been found that transformational leadership, which is most often, as I say, when we're going through change, aligns very closely to the way women prefer to lead or are successful at leading. And that can be linked to the fact that women tend to be more people focused. They tend to have the characteristics of compassion, kindness, motivating others, a collective good rather than an individualistic kind of approach. So when we look at the characteristics of leaders, if you look at what I have often referred to as the default position of leadership for many, many decades was a series of characteristics around things like assertiveness, intelligence, dominance, risk-taking, being competitive, and so on, which are some of the words that you previously used, Claire, there. And that kind of often referred to as a Gentic style. That means somebody who has great agency, they have a powerful approach to their own intentions and what they're trying to achieve, and the control of that is aligned more to a masculine rather than a feminine way of leading. Whereas the more collaborative, people-supporting approach that you get with transformational leadership is where we see women excel. And the work that you alluded to that I did recently with Fiona Wilkinson looked at self-confidence. Why is it that women, we hear anyway, quite often don't feel confident about leadership? And that can be looking at it in the context of these different styles and characteristics. Because if we look around ourselves, quite often that's how we gain our confidence. We look around and look for reassurance or feedback in our own behavior by seeing it in others. If you look around and you don't see a style of leadership that's consistent with your own, it can call you to question, and our own self-belief maybe fails us. So I think the more we talk about, is there one style of leadership, or is there more of a recognition that different styles are needed at different times? we can kind of encourage women not to fail because they meeting up to a default ideal position. It was interesting in COVID, you know, that it was often said that it was the women that stepped up and helped through very difficult crises that went on in organizations. And it may have been because they had a more fluid, more collaborative and more transformational approach to leadership. So it helps us to understand the context of leadership rather than particular genders, I think.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to bring Steve in now, and one of the things that I try and do with client talk is to get the diversity in terms of thinking, and actually the fact that you come with a knowledge, Susan, that's broader than professional services is great, and then Steve and I can hopefully try and think about some of those things through the lens of professional services. And one of the things that strikes me, Steve, with professional services firms is that, you know, whereas in a corporate you might have a managing board where, you know, there are a number of leaders, when you start thinking about law firms, about Big Four, there are hundreds of leaders, because all of the partners have a stake in the business, all of the partners are leaders. So how do you think the discussion that we're having fits with that notion of having lots of leaders? Does that allow for different styles, or does it mean that the dominant style really does embed itself?
Thank you, Claire. Hello, everybody. I see in my experience of both being part of 3 different professional services organizations and in working with professional services organizations now, that there probably is more opportunity to look at how leaders flourish because the diversity of the business is that we may be dealing with. It's more the case, I think, in consultancy organizations, but it's increasingly the case with law firms as well. That because the market is changing so rapidly and because we're seeing greater uncertainty in markets, there is the need to say, how do we respond differently to this? To give an example, the accountancy firms were very quickly into working internationally and bringing cultural impact and cultural understanding from different parts of the world into a leadership framework, a global leadership framework that set the scene rather than pointing the direction. And to give an example of that, I worked under a guy named Ian Powell, who was constantly saying, do the right thing. Do the right thing. I had a feel to it. It had a sense of what that right thing was. But that was a different sense for me when I was working in the Netherlands, when I was working in Central and Eastern Europe, and when I was working in the UK. So some of the directional skills that we've spoken about in terms of traditional leadership, I think have moved on. 1, because we've grown because of globalization, but 2, because of different styles of leadership that have come through. So I'm going to actually go to a war analogy now, which may not be the best analogy for the only man on the call, but I think it's relevant in terms of how we're seeing change. A general called Stanley McChrystal wrote about his experience leading. That was around having teams that were self-supporting and looked after themselves. And that's akin to the model that I see in effective partnerships. If you look at the current war in Ukraine, there is a complete difference. If you put propaganda to one side, there is a complete difference to the way that Zelensky is leading the Ukraine in terms of bringing in experts, being seen setting the tone, but largely leaving the day-to-day running of what happens to his ministers and to others in senior positions, compared to Vladimir Putin, who, if all is to be believed, wants to bring everything directional, everything reporting into him. And you read about the morale of the Ukrainian troops and the morale of the Russian troops, and you hear total differences in what's coming back in terms of good and bad leadership, inspiring good and bad performance.
Thanks, Steve. It's interesting, the reflection I've got in my head, and I'm going to apologise to Steve. Steve knows because he's been on his call to me before. I apologise to Susan because I always have some set questions and I always go completely off piece based on where the conversation takes us. So I apologise to both in advance. But
makes it more interesting.
well, so the thing that I'm reflecting on, and I will try and bring everyone into the conversation in a second, is that comment that you made about doing the right thing and actually focusing on, you know, what is the result that you're looking to achieve, and there are different ways of getting there, rather than, you know, this is what we're rewarding to get to where we're going to get to. And I have two reflections there. One from the experiences that I have coaching particular women who, you know, I can't be a leader because I need to now start leading in a way that's not in line with how I've led my career or who I am, and I now need to be all of these things that I'm not. And what I try and do when I'm coaching is taking a step back and thinking about, okay, well, what do you want to achieve, and why do you need to achieve it in the way that someone else has achieved it? So that's one reflection I've got. Interesting that you brought up culture, and of course Deloitte, not you were one of the rival firms, also talking about cultural intelligence, so that's interesting. And I think the thing that's going around my head is this idea of reward, and what do we reward in professional services firms, particularly legal, and how does that drive things? What I want to do is I want to throw it back to you and Susan to kind of not really a question, but just to carry on the thought that thoughts that I'm having. But what I'd like to do in the background is I have a poll which I'm going to launch that's in the background, and for those online it'd be really helpful just to sort of get a sense of the organizations that you're in, and looking down the list, I think there are, you know, we are predominantly from the legal sector. And the question I have is, does your organization have more transactional leaders or transformational leaders? So it'd just be interesting if you don't think that there is a dominant style, then that's fine, but just be interesting to have a think about which of the two you think are more dominant in your workplace. Give people a few minutes to answer that, and then we can reflect on that as well. And if you have questions, do please bring those in.
Claire, just to pick up on one point you raised there about reward, which I think is hugely important in why people step up and put themselves forward for leadership. So one of the issues is, why don't more women put themselves forward? Is just to say that one of the issues is around reward. So what men look for in a reward and women look for may be different. And women don't necessarily look for reward in terms of money or even status, but they look for other rewards, which may be, going back to this idea of collective, they're looking for reward in terms of how to make change, because by default, most women are in situations where they want things to be done differently. We want the world to move forward in terms of how we can lead our lives. So reward is a very interesting one, because if you've got a gendered organization where most reward is set by the leadership, which is male, then the assumption is reward is about titles, it's about money, and so on. But for women, it might be around working flexibility, or it may be around how collectively the team operates or the resources they're given. It may be very different. So I think that issue of reward is such an important one. And again, there's almost like a default assumption about rewards, which align to a default view of what leadership's about. So maybe leadership for some, if you're agentic, is I have more power, whereas most women aren't really looking for more power. They're looking for other rewards.
And it's interesting because for apologies to those that have read my report and have heard me talk about it before, because I'm repeating myself, but you know, the conclusion that I came to was that actually a lot of this comes back to choice, and women choosing not to progress to partner, choosing not to progress to general counsel, because actually what they see is not something that they want. And you know, and conversely, the men, you know, some of them really struggling with the idea of, you know, I don't feel I'm in a position to be able to say no to this. So that's interesting. So let me share the results of this, and then we'll carry on the conversation. And please, if you have questions, feel free to say in the chat what that might be, or if you want to take yourself off mute, we'll let people heckle us. So what's interesting with the results, which hopefully you can now see, what's interesting is that, so 70% participated. So that's interesting because it suggests that 70% of you do identify there being a dominant style. Perhaps those that haven't answered weren't sure. And the majority have identified transactional leadership as being the dominant. And, you know, we should say here, and Susan, you've already picked up on it, is not that there is a right or a wrong style. They are different styles, and in different contexts, different styles work. And, you know, if you're working on a big transaction, I used to be a transactional lawyer, then having a transactional leader is probably quite helpful because it means you get things over the line. So that's really interesting. So I am going to ask a question of Steve. I'm then going to encourage everyone to think about and to share some thoughts on. And that is, Steve, if the dominant style is that of the transactional leader, which fits with the quick poll that we've just done, but it also fits with you know, the traits that came through from my study in terms of who, you know, what we see in our partners. What are we missing if that's the dominant style? Steve, I'm going to throw it to you first. Is Steve still with us?
I think you might have lost him.
I think we might have lost Steve, so we won't throw it to Steve, we'll throw it to Susan. Susan.
I am not a lawyer, and I don't come from a legal background. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the work that I do is much broader than this. What I would say is that quite often what happens is that leadership style links very much to culture and, as you say, the requirements of the job, let's call it like that. So if we're not seeing much transformational styles in legal firms, it may be because the industry is very established, it isn't going through the kinds of change and turmoil. So if you look at industries that I've worked in, such as looking at retail is going through an enormous disruption with technology and changes to the way in which the customer is behaving. Now in legal, I assume that it's a pretty steady Eddie situation in terms of the structures and the ways in which clients and law firms interact. So you almost don't have the need for change because it's not a turbulent industry that's going through disruption. So quite often the need for change and what kind of spearheads styles of leadership comes from what's going on in the industry. So transformational style may not be favored or might not even be needed because you know, it may be about to, but at the moment it hasn't kind of actually. So when we look at working practices, I think it's really interesting what's going on with as we come out of COVID about hybrid working, remote working, and this big kind of governmental thing that's going on where they want everybody back at their desks. Everybody back at their desks is very much a transactional and control style of management. Some organizations, particularly tech, very young startups, retail, a lot of these industries are favoring hybrid working, remote working, and are very, very happy with a kind of more transformational style of leadership. So I would suggest that it depends on the future trajectory of the legal sector as to whether or not change might slowly need to bubble up because of what's going on in the industry if it's changing.
And this is why I love bringing people in that aren't from the industry, because it just sparks more thoughts and more conversations and new the gently boiling frog that is legal. Love your comment. We're going to pick that up, and I'm going to throw it over to Steve. But I think it's a really interesting reflection for the reason that I think the legal sector, and we'll focus on the legal because that is where my bread and butter is. And Steve, I know that you're kind of a bit broader than that, so it might be interesting to reflect on where legal might go based on what happened with the Big Four. But you know, legal, I think, is in a space where there is a lot of disruption that is happening around the big city firms. So there are different models. Some of my clients do legal design, a really good example of a disruptive force. The O-shaped lawyer that we mentioned there is about clients saying we want our services delivered in a more empathetic way, in a different way. Yet it is a model that, you know, from the outside looking in, works. Law firms are hugely profitable. They remained hugely profitable over COVID. They will continue to be profitable whether the economy goes up or down, because you know, what gets less busy in one area will become busier in another. Insolvency thinking sadly in my head. So, you know, perhaps it's an industry that, you know, has this core which is, you know, stays stable, perhaps doesn't see the need for change as much, maybe because of the leadership styles, and that's getting in the way of perhaps changing things up in a way that they need to be. I don't know. Steve, over to you. What do you think?
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I want to take a very legal focused perspective on this, and paint a picture that hopefully is encouraging in terms of the change that I think is beginning to happen in law firms, and that is needed in law firms. So Claire hadn't shared with me the O-shaped lawyer, but I think that is really indicative of law firms and maybe their clients it showing the way that progress needs to go within law firms. And I don't think it's just clients that are doing that. I think there are two other factors. The first is just looking at the some of the current styles of leadership and just some of the words that are used. So collaborative connector, authentic pragmatism, paradoxical leadership, team leadership. These are all areas of leadership models that have come through in the last probably 10 years. And all of those words for me are consistent with what Claire was saying about Deloitte's 6 Cs and what Susan's been saying about the change in leadership generally. They are about what the market is looking for. They are about what firms are looking for, whether they're forced to because of some degree of getting a balance that they're really pushing back against, or whether they're actually more active in saying, we need to get this right because it is going to benefit our business. And the trend is very much in favor of bringing more of these qualities into the way that law businesses are led. My second point is around observations in what's going on from a demographic point of view. I think that a lot of what I read about leadership is stuck in the past. It's about baby boomers leading Generation X. And we now have the opportunity to look at how millennials lead Generation Z. And I think that's a perspective that is actually happening. And if we go looking for it, we will find more examples of that, more examples of, I'm going to use the tone that we've been using in the conversation, stale males going out of the market and something new coming into the market, something new coming into leadership, something that responds to what is needed because of everything that's going on in our world at the moment, whether that's a VUCA world or whether that's just the paradoxes that we have to deal with now in terms of leadership being more complicated. And my final point on this is, I don't think that we look hard.
Steve has frozen. Hopefully we'll.
Yeah, he's obviously having internet problems.
Internet problems.
We'll be having the same challenges as women are having. But this is what we're seeing across leadership. And for males, it's probably going to be more helpful to point out that this is not just a female thing, this is a new leadership approach.
Thanks, Steve. I think we got most of that. Your internet connection is a little bit unstable, but I have to say I'm totally grateful to Steve because he's only just arrived in the States for a holiday, and just to kind of demonstrate the passion with which he comes to this topic, he has agreed to do this despite the fact it's ridiculously early in the morning and he's sitting in in a hotel room. But we won't feel too sorry for Steve, because he's going to be going off probably to the beach later. Nu, you have your hand up. What would you like to
I
ask?
just wanted to check in with what Steve was saying at the end there, because what the end bit was really tantalizing. I think what you were saying, Steve, is that we shouldn't frame this as transformational leadership as necessarily gendered. What we should say is, oh, hello, he's turned into a windmill now. What we should say is that this is a new style that's needed, and irrespective of gender.
Yeah, and
I've turned my camera off, so hopefully you can hear me a bit better.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I think that is a good summary of what I'm trying to say. The things I hear are, we have been working as women to work out what it is that's best for us in terms of organizational. And sometimes that's the way it can come across, and not for me, but for some people, that immediately diverts away from what do we need to lead organizations to, what's this difference we've got to women first of all? And I'm increasingly hearing from people who say, I want to work across gender on this, rather than set up a them and us. And I think some of that, still recognize diversity, still recognize difference, but to find some other message as well to support that agenda, rather than something that's contrary to it.
And I want to pick up on that, because for me it's really important, and I haven't got the answer, and so I'll share a reflection. So I was very careful when I wrote my report and did my research to speak to men and women. The conclusion I came to ultimately was that women choose not to progress, and they're happy with that choice. And they have managed to balance the things that they want to balance. The men that I spoke to actually were troubled by some of the choices that they had to make. Some felt like they didn't have a choice, and some felt like it was very difficult to say no, but also once you were there, very difficult to then step away. And I should say that whilst the report focused on the sad numbers, so my intake started off 60% female, it ended 20 years later. I mean, clearly it's still going, we're not all dead, but where we are now is that 23% of the females had, I hate using the term made it, but I've not found a better one, had risen to a leadership position versus 60% of the men. So that was where I started. But actually the reflections that I had around culture impact mental health, they impact burnout, they impact men as much as they do women. And actually, I do a lot of work with clients and client listening. I used to be, whilst I started life as a lawyer, many years in business development in law firms. And actually, you know, the way the culture currently is in law prevents diverse teams in terms of discipline. So, you know, there's not the same parity with business development professionals, project managers, accountants, the list goes on within law. And I think actually that's where Steve, professional services firms as in PwC, hopefully Steve can still hear us as he's frozen, do better. But the lawyer picked up my report with the title, "It's the Men We Feel Sorry For." Despite the fact that that was the title that the lawyer used, 80% of the people who have downloaded my report are female. I have done a number of talks on the topic, and I've been careful and mentioned it right from the beginning how I've framed it. It tends to be women that come online. I did a talk at the Law Society in Scotland last week on this, and again, there were no men in the audience. And the reflection that I had when I was talking to the person at the Law Society who put it on for me, who happened to be male, he said that it was interesting because when they do things around race, it isn't just those who are of colour who join the conversation. There is a mix. People want to find out more. When they do something that is around sexuality, it is, you know, it is a mix of people who come online. Yet there is this funny thing that when you start to do something which is about gender, it is just the women that come online. And yet again, reflections that I had when I was researching, and I do want this now to be a conversation, so do please join in and ask questions and share reflections. That so I spoke to one woman who said, why is it always the women that have leadership programs to try and make it to partner? Because effectively, and going to Susan, what you found, it's about saying that you need to act like this in order to be able to get to where you need to get to. And actually, huge impact on self-confidence there. But also, why don't we, and I remember, and I can't remember who said it, and it doesn't matter because it was all under confidentiality anyway, why don't men have sessions which show them how they can be diverse, how they can embrace different styles of leadership? So Steve, you missed a bit of that, but it was a long waffle basically to get to, how do we get men engaged? How do we get more men involved? Because it's, this isn't just a male female issue. This is a how do we create organizations that embrace diversity in all of its forms, for the benefit of all. So how do we get the men on board? Susan?
But my view is that we have to change we have to reframe, so change the language and change the frame that we put around this. So at the moment, this whole discussion that we're having that is constantly I attended this week IGPP, a big conference with people like Jess Phillips talking about exactly the same issues. And we, at the moment, have framed it that this is a woman's problem. This is women that have got, women getting into leadership, women not being, rather than this is an organizational issue, and that there are benefits for change for both men and women. So I think the position that a lot of men have is, well, I haven't got a problem, I'm okay. Sorry, let's just fix the women. And so, as you say, we have women's leadership programs, a lot of coaching is given for women and so on. Actually, we need to say, this isn't just a woman's problem, because as you say, Claire, increasing and improving diversity in organizations improves everything for everyone, not just for that group. And when I use the word diversity, I think we should stop using diversity solely around gender or race. What I mean by diversity is people from all backgrounds, diversity of thinking, diversity of educational background, the kind of school you came from. So many industries are jammed full of, I've working with real estate, property, high-end property companies. It's jammed full of white public school boys. So diversity is about race, it's about gender, but it's also about education, it's about thinking, it's about behavior, and start talking about it in that context. What do we want leaders to look like of the future? When Steve mentioned Gen Z, I've got a son of 28. When I look at my son, he's in finance. He looks nothing like what we would expect a leader to look like. And in probably about 10 years' time, he's going to be in a senior leadership position. He has tattoos. He wears his hair shaved. He does not look like the average leader would look like. But I can guarantee you he is headed in that direction. So we've got to kind of step outside of our comfort zone, but particularly I think for men, they'd rather stay in that comfort zone because they don't see it as their problem, but it is a problem, if you want to call it that. I don't like using the word problem, but it's a challenge for all of us that we have to change the dialogue and the mindset around what we see a leader looking like. A leader can look like anything in the future. And that diversity, as you say, Claire, is what we're looking for. So I think women have got to stop making it something that we just talk about, but bring in a whole kind of range of people to talk with us about this. That's the way I would focus it.
Steve, I'm going to bring you in and I'm going to ask a quite specific question, because it's something that I think about in different contexts. But so Steve knows because he's met him, but my husband's an economist, and so I often talk about things with him, and economists talk a lot about kind of nudge theory and how do you get people to move, etc. And one of the things that we have discussed before, and I bring it up often in the context of client listening, where often you can see the benefit. So you'll go and talk to a client and the client will want something to change, and you can see that there's a firm benefit for the firm to make the change that the client has asked. but the action and the pain is felt at an individual level. So it might be that the partner needs to act in a different way, might be that the partner needs to remove themselves from the team, whatever it might be. So actually, whilst the talk is of, don't worry, this firm relationship is going to be better as a result of what you individually are doing, the individual hears, oh gosh, this is going to be painful for me. And the reflection I have around all of this is that I think there is a understanding, I think there's even an acceptance in big firms that we need diversity. And again, those that have heard me before will know that absolutely with Susan, in terms of, and I'm not just talking gender, I'm not just talking race, I'm talking diversity of thinking, and actually in the context of legal, diversity of thinking in terms of the team and bringing in different disciplines. And I think there's an acceptance of that. But I think when you then maybe talk to individual partners, and they may or may not admit it, but thoughts around, okay, well, this might mean that I'm not going to be earning as much, or this might mean that I'm going to start being rewarded for things that I've not been rewarded for in the past, and actually I'm not that good at. So there's that level of, okay, I can see the firm benefit, and fine, you have your diversity committee and have your well-being committee, and let's bring the dogs to work, but actually I don't want to change on a personal level. So what would you kind of respond to that, Steve, and how can we get around that?
So I think around having more dialogue around what is needed for this change, but also this improvement in organizational effectiveness to happen. I mean, the first thought that comes into my head has to be team coaching, getting individuals to work through this in a team coaching environment where all views can be held and given equal weight. Beyond that, it is about a number of different, not an either or comment just before I got kicked out. And my response, which I started typing, was around, you've got to have a versatile toolkit on this. And the emphasis on this is for the organization is very important. I've seen organizations where average retirement age has come down significantly. I was actually part of that and partly driven through my own choice to leave PwC, but I recognize that PwC wasn't a place for people in their 50s. And that has increasingly happened in terms of numbers coming down in their 50s, more emphasis on different ways of working, different client demands, different interactions, different abilities to build teams that will become applicable, if they're not already, and more important, to law firms. Silos need to go because clients don't look at silo results anymore. And I think if you can keep looking at the organizational benefits and have discussions about this and keep the discussions focused on the organizational benefit or the benefit for everybody. And I don't know as a woman, but I'm guessing you probably need to downplay some of the things you really want to say and bring them in later once you've established the discussion ground for the organizational benefit. Thanks,
Steve. We've got 10 minutes. I want to open it to the floor now. So has anyone got any thoughts, reflections? Do you disagree with anything we said? It's always good to have someone who's got a different view because it helps increase our knowledge and thoughts. So would anyone like to come into the conversation?
Well, I can't bear a silence, Claire, you well know that. I'm just interested to follow up on what Steve was saying there at the end, that women might want to play down some of the things they might want to say and establish something else first. I'd just like to know say a little bit more about that, Steve.
Yeah, it's a sense of thinking about what your audience rather than you what to say, and that was something I much more widely than to this particular point. And I probably should have said it that way first.
I take your point. I understand what you're saying genuinely in order to have influence. I'd be interested to know what Susan thinks about that, because my sense of that, one of my mantras lately is that this profession that we're talking about in law is 56% women overall in the UK. In the lower echelons, it's more than 60% female. It's a female profession already, and it is not designed for women or by women. So clearly it's going to have to head in that direction. But we're in a very strange kind of rump era, you know, not Trump, but rump, that we're in this time when in fact it is the male, pale and stale people who are still in charge. And we have got a much more cookie cutter mentality to what future leaders look like. And that does alienate women. And I think what Claire's research showed brilliantly was that it's not the kind of, no, you don't fit here completely. It's the what's unsaid. It's the or what's not, or where the encouragement's not given. So if a woman says, I'd like to work differently, it's not, oh, well, that's fine. Of course, how can we help? It's, oh, well, we can't accommodate that. Classic example of that is how to get partnership. You've got to be at least 4 days a week. It's not about, and it's not about, you know, so my mantra at the moment is design for women, the men will come anyway. And that's always true. That's always true. But I think it's a kind of statement that you would say maybe alienate the male audience at the moment. But I don't know. I'm quite up for being a little bit radical and disruptive and making things change. I'm a little bit over. I'm 54. You know, something's got to change fast because there ain't that much longer. You know, so I'd be interested to know what Susan thinks.
Yeah, one of the sort of paradoxes, or double bind you might call it, that women get into is that in order to progress and succeed, particularly early, so I've got a very great interest in early years women, what happens to women between leaving university and getting to about 35 or 40. Women come out of university with higher grades, you know, more firsts than males do. They go into the workplace as graduates in equal, if not greater numbers. And yet within 10 years, the figures are that about 30% are not still progressing at the level that the males are. So something happens in those early years. And my sense is that quite often women are in this situation where you've only got two options. You either have to conform to that default that I was mentioning, and so almost become like the boys, you know, language, you know, going and having a beer after work, all the kinds of things, but also becoming this quite assertive person. And if you go too far down that road, then you're accused of being bossy, shouty, a difficult woman, assertive. Because why? Because that is contradictory to what in society our stereotype is of a woman. So our stereotype of a woman is much more about compassionate and soft. But if you go that route, then you're weak and you never get promoted. So women almost have to, I think, plow a sort of neutral, their own authentic row of what they want to do, rather than trying to be something. You know, if you go to work and constantly are trying to be something that you're not, that's incredibly stressful. And most women do kind of bow out of the industry, as your report showed, Claire, I think because they just get exhausted by trying to be what they're not, rather than just allowing them to be themselves. So my view is that, you know, you should go to work and be yourself, I hate to use the word authentic because it's so overused, but it is a case of, rather than looking around and saying, oh, I've got to be like that, go to work and be the best version of a leader that you can be. And when I mention this idea that, or evidence that there is, that a lot of women are quite transformational in their leadership, I think it's because those that really are successful are the ones who actually say, I'm going to do it differently. And so by default, they're changing the structures that are around them. I think it's exceptionally difficult when in an industry like the legal profession, which is very established and very long-standing, and you have very well-established structures there, it's a harder thing to change. Whereas if you look at, so if you go into what's called fintech, edutech, all these new tech companies, it's much more of a level playing field. And I think a lot of the young men and women would look at what they hear about in law and just kind of be amazed. I think it's very much, it is very different by industry type. So I would suggest that those of you in the legal profession have got a more uphill battle, unfortunately. But I think it's about being yourself. And I really believe in allyship, Nicola. I really believe in, you know, casting around and seeing which particularly younger males in the industry that you work with are actually supportive of this. Why? Because they've got wives and daughters and sisters and so on, and start to get them involved in the conversation, to start saying, yeah, perhaps we could do things differently around here. Because I think you have to bring, as I said before, you've got to bring the men into this conversation to make it change.
So we've got a few minutes left. I want to end on a positive. I think it has been a positive session, but I like to end on a positive. I like to end on an action. So I'm going to think about action now in the last few minutes. And I want to think about, and I've kind of latched onto this agent for change concept. That's my mantra at the minute now. But what, we can all be agents for change. So what's the one thing that we can all do kind of after today's session to start to think about the future and to start to create cultures that we want to be part of? I'm going to start with you, Susan, and then Steve, but I'd invite everyone, either to share or to think about, what can we be doing to change? One of the things that I'm passionate about personally is having conversations, because I think the more conversations we have, the more our ideas develop, and the more we realize that other people are thinking in similar ways. And if those conversations can be diverse, then we can start to have different perspectives in as well. So Susan, what do you think we can do to be an agent for change?
Yeah, this idea of allyship is really strong now. The idea that, we aren't going to make these changes on our own, and there's no point in us just, I say us women, sorry Steve, us women just all keep getting into huddles and going, oh, it's not fair, and talking about these things. We have to bring others in with us. So this is not going to change without working alongside others in the organization that can be your ally. And as I say, I think that in particular, what Steve mentioned about generational change, so Gen Z, which is, pretty young people now coming through from university, and millennials have a different perspective on this. And I think that's where the allies really lie. So if we slowly build that approach of, and I know we all, don't we, Claire, to get, but I think we have to get them into dialogues, debates, events, anything like this. I'm very much not in favor of the kind of women only approach, either to leadership training programs or any of these sorts of things, because the solution lies with all of us. I mean, if you look at the example of, how Mandela looked at South Africa, he immediately said, everybody is part of this solution. It's not just a few people. So my view of agents for change would be work out who your allies can be and encourage others to be part of what you're talking about.
Thanks, Susan. Steve?
Yeah, I want to pick up first on Vicky's comment on the chat, which I agree with. There are more allies than we realise, but they don't know how to show their support. And Susan talked about allyship within organisation. I think your clients are potentially allies as well. The observation that law is an older profession, I would agree with. PwC average age of the organisation hovered around 28, 29. So very different demographic perspective to law firms, and maybe older lawyers, if I can use that term, have to see that allyship in their clients as well as within their firms.
Thanks, Steve. Louise, was there something you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, I'm going to stay off camera.
That's absolutely fine.
So it actually ties back into allyship and just some of the things I've been hearing being talked about. But I think role models are incredibly important in driving any kind of change. And possibly controversially, I want to say we should raise visibility around male role models that do encourage diversity and that do exhibit transformational leadership styles and that do embrace different ways of working. As an example, I often speak to people in my social circle who will say, my husband would love to ask for paternity leave. My husband would love to ask for flexible working. If he dares raise his voice, how he will out of those impact on feels almost equal. often what women would feel in that situation. And I think we don't also realize that there are lots of men that you know, different ways of working, different ways of leading, being more collective and collaborative would be very beneficial to all. And for me, you know, if you do find those brave souls that do stand up, that do act differently, that do lead differently, I think we should encourage those role models at all times. So that was my one thought.
Thank you, Lisa. And I agree, absolutely. My husband, and again, I've written about this, you can find it on the website, but so my husband took, we did share parental leave, so I took 3 months and my husband took 3 months. He was the first in his organization to do it because it was when it just came in, and my husband got promoted whilst he was on parental leave in a way. And you know, and that for me, until more men start doing that, you know, we're all the poorer for it. So I have several buttons, and who knows me, because we've done a number of events together as well. I've got certain buttons. Billable hour is another button that I've not gone down, that I can then go on a rant for a while, so we won't go there. But what I want to do is I would just want to share this slide, because I'm hopeless and I never bother doing this, so I am going to do it today whilst I remember, just in terms of different ways to continue the conversation. So Steve and I are going to be doing a masterclass in October on coaching as a leadership style, which is very much in line with the transformational style that Susan mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to circulate an early bird code, so if anyone wants to join that, there is a cost, but you will have a discount for having joined us today. I'm also going to circulate an email with both a link to my calendar, to Susan's calendar, to Steve's email. So if you want to continue the conversation with any of us individually, then please do reach out. We're always happy to talk about this stuff, because we all thrive on discussion, because it helps us grow and learn, and you know, there's a reason why I've pulled us all three together. You can find us on LinkedIn and talk to us there, and you can subscribe to Client Talk. I sound like you can subscribe to Client Talk to find out more about various things. But one of the things I did want to flag is that the latest article on the website, on the blog, is an article about confidence, but that has a link to Susan's research, which is fantastic. And Louisa, it does pick up about role models and the importance of those on self-confidence and the impact that that has. So I would encourage you to go to the blog, have a read about confidence there, but also to find Susan's research and read that. So we're a little bit over, so thank you for bearing with us. Thank you ever so much for your time today. Steve, thank you for joining us from the States. Enjoy the rest of the day in the sunshine. Susan has been very well this week, so also thank you to her for joining today. And yeah, thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.